The Herald's Soul is a fantasy/drama webtoon that introduces us to a trio of siblings who encounter a group of otherworldly dog/demon things called rogue spirits. One of the rogue spirits lures away the younger sibling Nora into an ambush. Fortunately, her siblings, Cassia and Den, come to her rescue and reprimand her for splitting the party. As Cassia carries an injured Nora back home, Nora expresses frustration at not being able to help with the world's situation, which is going downhill fast according to the people in charge. There's more to it than what I've said here, of course. It's just a brief summary of the 4 chapters that were up when I wrote this review. The series has the following description. In a world on the verge of apocalypse via otherworldly monsters, Cassia and her siblings fight to protect the family while searching for a way to get to the root of it all and bring an end to a war older than time. As a description, this works. It's short, succinct, and describes the interesting stuff that will be in the comic: a pending apocalypse, otherworldly monsters, a theme of family and sibling bonds, and a war older than time. To be honest though, it didn't quite grip me. There's a lot of elements going on in this one line of description, and it just kind of all blends into a blur for me. If you were to ask me what I thought the premise of this comic is, I'd probably say it's about saving the world, probably. I don't have a clear feeling for what the comic is about. A catchy description chooses one thing and really leans into it. This is easy enough if your comic is based around a high concept, like princess but unattractive, or the main character was condemned to the deepest circle of hell, what did she do? Or what if people are forgotten the moment they die? This can be harder if your comic explores many ideas, subplots, themes, and character arcs, and is set in an organic world that isn't based around one particular idea. If you can't lean into a high concept, you could lean into an emotional appeal instead. What kind of feelings does your comic evoke? Is it a blood-pumping action series about hacking and slashing your way through hordes of monsters? Is it a grounded, realistic setting where danger is around every corner and one wrong step could mean death? Is it a cunning, strategic plot about playing 10D chess, outmaneuvering your enemies and the obstructive authorities? Is it a character-focused story about a tight-knit group and their family bonds? Is it an awe-inspiring epic set in a breathtaking world with ancient cosmic forces beyond human comprehension? Forget genre, I say. Emotional appeal is the most important thing one needs to decide on when writing a story. You could take the approach of describing your comic as accurately and succinctly as possible, like the Herald Soul did. In essence, such a description will function as a set of hashtags, which makes it easier for people who are looking for those things to see your comic and go, that's something I'm interested in. It just won't net you many people who aren't actively looking for your kind of comic. Maybe that's something you're okay with, and indeed it's better to have a functional description than a description that tries to be evocative but ultimately doesn't feel faithful to your comic. Oh, one other little nitpick. The intro sets up Cass, the big sister, as the protagonist, but the first 4 chapters are more focused on Nora, the little sister. I found this kind of threw me off a little, and I got their names mixed up once or twice. Though I guess this might be unavoidable if the main story overall focuses really heavily on Cassia, but you need to establish early on in the plotline about Nora not having a gift. I noticed the author's note kept mentioning a change in art style, but I honestly didn't notice any change during a first read-through. To me, the art style seems pretty consistent. On closer examination, I think this art style change might be referring to the fact that they seem to be experimenting a little with how they convey emotion. It's really subtle though, and doesn't really constitute an art style change in my opinion, but I definitely feel an improvement on how emotion is conveyed over the 4 episodes. The backgrounds are well drawn, and there are enough of them to convey the general feel of the location. I personally didn't get a good sense of location in the logistical sense, but more on that later when we talk about the writing. The perspective can look a bit off at times, like with these doors, but it's probably not too noticeable to your average reader who's probably paying less attention to the backgrounds than I was. Overall, the art is polished and pleasing to look at. The character and creature designs are good. I don't have much more to say on this matter since I personally don't tend to get attached to characters from visual design alone. There's a good through line in the plot so far, with one thing leading to another in a natural way. Nora's frustration about feeling useless compared to her siblings leads directly into the exposition about how the world is getting more dangerous and the authorities are pushing for younger and younger kids to become hunters because things are getting that desperate. Speaking of exposition, the information is introduced naturally and at a good pace, which avoids the common mistake fantasy stories make of dumping a whole bunch of world building onto you at once, before you have a reason to care enough to put in the mental effort into combing through it all. The characters are likable, though admittedly not so much so that I'm immediately attached to them in an I stan or must protect kind of way. The sisters have a wholesome relationship and charming banter. I can definitely see a potential for these characters to grow on you. That said, the story didn't exactly hook me. Most of the resources out there talking about hooks mostly mention plot hooks or mystery hooks. I don't think this is very helpful, and not just for slice of life stories either. Even heavily plot-driven series suffer from limiting themselves to plot hooks. In fact, I think plot hooks are in general really difficult to pull off. If you do happen to have something truly unique and attention-grabbing happen at the start of your story, that's great. But most of the time, the most epic, impactful moments of your plot tends to be the climax or the ending and tend to be very spoilery, which makes them unsuited for the beginning. I think the Herald's Soul is an instance of the latter. From the start, it gets into the plot of fighting against these otherworldly monsters causing the apocalypse, as well as what I assume is Nora's character arc. But neither of these elements are exactly uncommon. We've probably all seen monster apocalypses and hot-headed youngsters eager to prove their strength and usefulness. It's kind of the action/adventure equivalent of the standard mystery hook of, oh no, someone was murdered. Who done it? It's like, look, people get murdered all the time in fiction. I don't see much reason to care why this person got murdered any more than why that other person in that other story, who I know equally little about, got murdered. When it's done enough times, it just doesn't work as a hook anymore. To get around this, one option is to make use of the powerful climactic moments as hooks by starting in media res and end the scene before the spoilers hit. Another option is just not use a plot hook and lean on some other appeal to hook your reader with instead. For instance, you can hook them with spectacle, draw some breathtaking scenery, weird fantasy objects, something really cool looking you don't see often in other stories. The Herald Soul has the rogue spirits, which are cool looking, but there's already an abundance of cool looking otherworldly monsters in fantasy to the point we're kind of desensitized to them by now, so it doesn't end up being a strong spectacle hook. When you don't have a plot hook, your story can be seen as starting off slow, but that doesn't mean a slow starting story doesn't need a hook. One of my favorite instances of something that starts off slow is the video game Trails in the Sky. For Sky, you might think the hook is the mysterious kid that the main protagonist's dad brings with him when he comes home, but as far as hooks go, it's not that strong. Mystery kids being adopted into the family isn't exactly uncommon, so we don't have much of a reason to care about this one for that reason alone. Instead, the real hook is these absolute gems of dialogue the protagonist delivers in these early prologue scenes. This shows a certain charm in the character writing in this game, and makes me want to stick around just to see more of it. Oh, and there's also plot stuff going on, I guess. It's still good to make your reader aware of that early on in a plot-driven story for pacing reasons, but it doesn't need to be the hook. The Herald Soul has some charming interactions as well. For instance, this moment where Nora points out that Cass just roasted her own love interest, and Cass is like, oh no, my arms are getting tired. I just think there needs to be something like that earlier, like episode 1. That way you can hook the reader with characterization. There are probably other ways to hook a reader as well, but I think I've talked about this long enough, so let's move on. I mentioned not getting a good sense of location in the logistical sense. It's not always necessary, but it depends on what you're going for in your scene. For instance, when Nora runs off, I know she goes into an alleyway, then jumps over a wall, then up some stairs. And that's fine. The point was she ran off after the rogue spirit to prove herself and maybe get into enough danger to awaken her gift. Where she ran off to wasn't really important. But for me, the appeal of a chase scene kind of hinges on seeing the environment they run through enough for me to get some spatial awareness. So I'd either draw more intermediate shots and really focus on the scene as an opportunity to show off your world, or show Nora run off and then just cut to the encounter as soon as possible. The former gives you more breathing room and lets you keep Nora's lines about her thoughts during the encounter, but I don't think you need them too badly. The follow-up, where her siblings come in to rescue her, does a good job conveying her motivations on its own, and I think we still get a good sense of Nora's character without her lines from the chase scene. Even if we don't, it's not always necessary to spell things out crystal clear from the get-go. Even if Nora is supposed to be a straightforward, transparent kind of character, it's okay to have a little ambiguity. Personally, I didn't quite catch on that the blurry bubbles denoted Nora's internal monologue until the second episode. In episode 2, Nora shouts, "Ori!" At first, I thought she was calling someone's name, but then decided it's probably supposed to be a swear word in this universe. I also found there to be a small but jarring tone shift with the rest of these lines, coming across as tired and sluggish, but a sudden spike in energy with this exclamation. If Ori was indeed a swear word, I'd probably have her mutter it instead, so more like, "Ori, slow down a little, will you?" In contrast, her next exclamation of, "Well, bring it on," fits in nicely because by then she's caught her breath and the immediate preceding lines are spoken with normal energy. I was a little thrown off by this line. To me, it implies the monster has to get in line after Nora for being killed by her siblings, but doesn't Nora want to kill it herself? In general, I personally feel you'd be better off cutting out Nora's internal monologue in the first 2 episodes. I think the art as well as her conversation later with her siblings were sufficient to establish her feelings during this scene. And internal monologues kind of try to pull a scene towards an introspective tone, which I don't quite feel is fitting for these scenes. The dialogue in episodes 3 and 4 flowed much better in my opinion, and I had trouble putting my finger on why, but I think this is it. At first read through, I didn't realize this was Cassia telling Nora to climb onto her back. I thought she was leaving and telling Nora to follow her, so I was thrown off by the following dialogue. To make this clearer, I'd probably have Cass point to her back while kneeling in this panel. Since all the internal monologue up to this point has been Nora's, I first assumed this was Nora thinking as well, but I'm pretty sure now it's supposed to be Cassia's. I see now that Nora and Cassia's lines use different coloured bubbles, but it's really subtle and hard to notice at first glance. I think this is also where the decision to have dialogue bubbles outside of panels is working against you. With speech bubbles it's okay, since there's a tail pointing to the person speaking, but with no tails on thought bubbles, it's kind of hard to tell who is thinking these lines when they lie outside the panel. In contrast, something like this would make it clearer it was Cassia. Would I recommend this webtoon? Honestly, I think it's a bit too early to tell. I feel like this is going to be one of those stories that start off kind of slow but get really good later on. And you have to beg your friends to stick with it just a bit longer because you really don't want to miss out on this, I swear. That being said, I haven't yet hit a point that makes me go, people need to see this. But it's only 4 episodes long so far, and it definitely has the potential to become something great. If you're interested in reading about a pending apocalypse in a dark fantasy flavor similar to Dragon Age Origins, or something with an emphasis on family and especially sibling relationships, it might be worth sticking around to see where this goes. Link is in the description.